Today we're fixing what I did previously on Genesis chapters 12 to 25. So this is sort of fix number 5. Again, usual blurb. I know I'm cheating and sort of thing, but they were so bad, the early ones, that I need to basically remake the whole of Genesis, I think. This is basically the story of Abraham, but in the middle is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is worth doing its own video for. So we'll sort of skip to 25, then come back to do Sodom and Gomorrah and take it from there. Interestingly, if you take the Bible chronology, does seem there would be some overlap between Noah and Abraham, but of course Noah lived for nearly 1,000 years. So at this point, we're something like 4,000 years ago, I think. Abraham, anyway. And the interesting thing about him is that the God of Abraham is the same as the God of Judaism, Christianity and Islam. So there's a common root there to some extent. And you get the Abraham Accords, that sort of thing. So that's sort of interesting. And he's our first sort of significant big dude, I suppose. And I suppose also the first person who sounds like this might be sort of real, as in it's lacking in some supernatural stuff. Or, a flood that wipes out the entire earth when there's not enough water to do that, and Adam and Eve, that sort of thing. There is still some weirdness in the story of this, but it's not as bad, if you see what I mean. So it does feel like a shift towards history, perhaps, to some extent. So Abraham, anyway, is just a dude who's going along doing his stuff. He's about 75 years old when God comes along. He doesn't have any kids at this point, and God talks about he's going to make him the father of nations, and his children are going to number bajillions and all that sort of thing. Understandably, Abraham is a little sceptical on this, but interestingly, he does what he's told. And he takes his wife. I should say Abraham at this point is known as Abram, and his wife is Sarah. They end up as Abraham and Sarah when God changes their names shortly. But God sends them off into the world. They're 75, he's just settling down and all the rest of it. And it's interesting the scepticism Abraham has for the idea that he's going to have children, because Noah, who's still kicking around at this point, presumably, had his kids at, 450 years old or something like that. So within a very short period, we had a big old change in what has become normal. God sends him anyway to the land of Canaan, which I completely missed at the time, but is, having subsequently read more, becomes significant and ends up as the promised land much later on. Abraham goes to Canaan. His cousin Lot goes with him as well, and his rest of his household, but the Lot thing is relevant. Gets there, and then there's immediately a famine, so he then goes to Egypt. So it seems a little bit random in that respect, but I guess life can be a bit like that, I suppose. So maybe that's adds a veneer of validity. Maybe there's an interesting bit when they get to Egypt. That Abraham is slightly concerned that his wife is apparently very attractive, and that people are going to kill him for her. So he persuades his wife to pretend that she's his sister. Turns out actually that she is his half-sister, but, okay, fine, fair enough, of its time maybe. So they do this anyway, and sure enough, the Pharaoh sees her and thinks, oh yeah, she's lovely, I'm going to take her as a concubine, and gives Abraham a position of some sort of authority, such that Abraham ends up becoming quite wealthy. But God doesn't like what the Pharaoh is doing in taking Sarah, being Abraham's wife, as his concubine, so it makes the Pharaoh sick. So it all comes out in the end that, oh no, she's my wife. And the Pharaoh's he's like, what the hell are you doing? You should have told me, and this is weird to have her back. And basically chucks him out of Egypt. It's, I don't quite understand how that's supposed to work, but there we go. That's the biblical storytelling, certainly at this point, that it is very short and missing in detail. There's a bit at this point which I didn't have in the original video, and I'm not redoing this in order just to fit that in, but it just seems daft if I'm going back to fix the video, and the bit that has later seemed a bit more relevant. I'm going to put it in. This is that Abraham's nephew Lot, is it nephew? I think it's his nephew, is abducted. As seems to be some sort of uprising where there's a bunch of different kings who are having a battle with each other. So I think it's 5 on one team and 9 on the other. 5 on one team, 4 on the other, so 9 in total. And there's a head king, sort of called Kedorlaomer, something like that, who sounds like he's been oppressing them, and they've risen up against him. And it sounds like Lot gets caught in the crossfire of this, so he gets sort of picked up and nicked by one of these baddie kings. So bearing in mind, there's 5 kingdoms on this side, so presumably there's quite a lot of people. But Abraham gets together 318 people out of his tribe thing, and goes to get it, kicks the crap out of all these kings apparently, gets Lot back. And yeah, it's a bit weird. it's not that weird. But then what happens from there is we have another king who comes along called Melchizedek. And he's the reason that I've put this back in here, because he turned up again in one of the Psalms later on. And I gather there's some interesting theories on who he is, despite the fact he's barely mentioned. So the idea is that this guy is some sort of high priest, which is kind of a new thing. And he comes out and he blesses Abraham. And then Abraham decides he's going to give him 10% of everything he owns from there on. And we're talking a couple of verses here. There's very little mention, and yet something clearly substantial seems to be the case about Melchizedek, who I did mention previously, but didn't quite do justice to, and didn't mention the tithe thing. So there's some interesting theories on who Melchizedek is, including that he could be an early incarnation of Jesus, which, interesting, but I'm going to put it in there anyway, just because I think there's something about that guy anyway. We then have Abraham's trying to have kids, and it's not going very well, so he decides he's going to have kids with his servant, something like that. And sure enough, she gets pregnant, but God isn't happy about this. This doesn't count. It's supposed to be with your wife, dude. So that son goes off and does other things. I don't think that ends particularly well. But Abraham and Sarah do eventually have kids, 100 years old or something like that. And they have a son called Isaac. There are a couple of notable things about Isaac, but the main one, I think, is that God tells Abraham to take Isaac up a mountain and sacrifice him. Yeah, I think this is a bit of a bone of contention for some atheists or people who just generally don't like the Old Testament. It's like God told him to kill this guy and his only son, his only son with his wife, at this point at least. But sure enough, Abraham, despite being a very flawed man, is clearly a very dedicated to God type man. So he takes Isaac up this hill carrying all the firewood. it's like psychotic, isn't it? Getting him to carry the fire he's going to be burnt on. And his son keeps asking, where's the sacrifice we're going to do, Dad? And it's like, a bit awkward. He gets up there, puts Isaac on this thing ready to set fire to him, and gets his knife ready to stab him. And apparently just as he's about to do this, an angel turns up and says, no, don't worry, God's only kidding, you don't have to do it, but well done on passing the test. I'm not sure, well no, I definitely wouldn't have passed that test. So that's a tricky one, isn't it? I guess there's something in that. Who could actually do that? You definitely need to be absolutely certain that God existed, and we don't really have much in this about what the form of interaction was between God and Abraham, but there we go. But yeah, so Abraham, clearly a very significant dude. Historically, not too much in this to be upsetting. So, having kids at 100, very unlikely, but it would be easy to reframe that as he wasn't 100, he was 40 or something. He dies at 175 apparently, so we have a massive normalisation compared to Noah, just one generation ago, I suppose. Isaac has kids called Jacob and Esau, who we will talk about in the next video. Actually, no, the one after next, because the next video we've got to go back and see what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah, because that gets proper mental. But yeah, so that is basically Abraham, the father of three religions. And then next we will pop back to Genesis 18 and 19 to look at Sodom and Gomorrah.